Special thanks, of course, to Affordable Prestige Cars for providing the vehicle in this review. On this occasion, something a bit different to the cars which I typically review with them. But of course, if you are on the market for something like a Jaguar or various other prestige cars for great prices, and of course, if you live in the southwest of the UK, or maybe even a bit further afield, of course, you can click the link right below in the description to check out their current stock. From the minute I saw that this Ram was for sale at Affordable Prestige, I had to review it, for two reasons. One, I wanted to see how it compared to the Ram SRT-10, which I reviewed in Beards and Cars quite some time ago. It was a less than stellar experience for a couple of reasons, one being its gearbox and two being its choice of drive, being rear-wheel drive only. This one has two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive modes. And also I was curious to see if they'd improve the handling or the suspension versus that model, and of course the gearbox as well. That one had, I believe, if memory serves, the same gearbox, at least in quad cab form, that the diesel had. And as great as I'm sure it feels in the diesel, putting a diesel gearbox onto a V10 Viper petrol engine just isn't really a well-made match, and it's one of the reasons why the manual versions of those tend to be more popular. But secondarily to that, and of course this is the main thing that I'll be touching on in the video, most people who do watch this video, especially who are new to the channel, will be watching it because it's a British review on British roads of an American car. So if you're even considering owning one, is it viable? Does a vehicle like this even work on UK roads? There are so many cliches to battle, from the left-hand drive to the size to the fuel to the weight. Is it worth considering for their prices, for their rarity? Or should you just go for something like a Range Rover on the luxury end? Should you go for something like a Ford Raptor or a Ford Ranger, more so in the UK, or a Mitsubishi L200, something more readily available? Is there any reason to really get a Ram beyond the Hummer factor, as I would often call it, just the cartoonish, over-the-top vibe that you get with certain big American cars? Well, I feel like I'm in a very unique position to be qualified to talk about this, because even though I don't drive a pickup, I'm sure I will at some point, but for the moment I don't. I do, on the other hand, drive two massive American cars in the form of classic Lincolns, both roughly the size of this Ram anyway. Especially my older 1960 shape, which is the biggest one they ever made. That one's 227 inches long, which is about the same as this. And even in terms of weight, the Lincoln's 2.5 tons, so it's not that far off on weight either. Of course, both are left-hand drive, both do about 10 to the gallon, which are significantly worse than this can do. Well, the first thing, to cut to the chase, is it's nowhere near as bad as you're thinking. In fact, left-hand drive becomes second nature so quickly you would be shocked. And I would actually go so far as to say that I prefer left-hand drive. I always choose it now if I can. I love it in the UK because although there are some occasions where it could be an issue, for example if you have to overtake something in oncoming traffic, in my case, I would say, how often does that really happen in a vehicle like this? It's not like you're ducking and diving through traffic. Secondarily, the drive-through, it could be a bit more of a pain. Again, I would counter that argument by saying, how often are you going through the drive-through alone? If you've got a passenger, they could just order for you. Or, I mean, if the worst came to it, why not just park and go in and do your order and then leave? So again, I don't consider those to be really issues as such. In reality, the benefits of left-hand drive, I think, far outweigh it. My favourite benefit of driving on the left is it allows me to overtake stuff like parked cars so ridiculously close that you never could if you were driving on the right. Plus, you also know that as long as you can see the white line or the edge of the road in roughly the edge of the bonnet area over your headlight, you know you're not in anyone else's lane. So it's pretty easy to get used to. In terms of size, well, again, the Lincolns are massive. I still park them in places like Aldi or Asda, and I haven't been hit yet, and they do just about fit in a space. A Ram is pretty big, so even though it's roughly the same, you'll probably end up being over the line more often than not, but again, that's a thing to just get used to. So these are learning curve things rather than actual downsides. I would say that getting used to the American import experience, especially in a big vehicle, is no way near as difficult as you'd think, so don't let that put you off by any means. Now in the case of this one, although commonly called a Dodge Ram here in the UK, it's actually not. Technically it's a Ram 1500. Of course it has the HEMI engine. There are a couple of different engine variations for 2016 and a number of different ones if you include all of these 4th gen Rams, which has a very wide swath of years. From 2009 includes this one and even beyond, and of course there were tons of updates, tons of different variations in there. This particular one being the HEMI, of course that means it has a 345 cubic inch or a 5.7 V8, just under 400 horses, 395, and just over 410 foot-pounds of torque, which is about 550, close to 560 newtons. So not quite diesel in terms of torque. There is also a Cummins version, which is up around the 6.7 litre mark, and depending on the model year you go for these 4th gen Rams, it goes all the way down to a 3.7 V6. The HEMI though does tend to be one of the more common ones that you'll see for obvious reasons, not quite as specialised as something like an SRT-10. For somebody who still wants the petrol factor and doesn't want the Cummins, it ticks a lot of boxes having a HEMI. It's big enough to be beefy, you feel like you have enough power and torque, and I can definitely confirm that the performance on this, and in particular the dynamics, its handling, its brakes, its road holding, are far better than you're probably imagining it. And that brings me to the comparison with the SRT-10. Because two of the reasons why I really didn't like the SRT-10, as I alluded to, were the transmission, or the gearbox as we call it over here, and in particular, the drive. Because that one was only available as a rear-wheel drive model, and because of that, and because it has all of its weight over the front and very little over the back end to me just felt like it was floating around all over the road, even on a dry day. Whereas here, you can see I'm driving this in wet conditions, and although I drove it in 4-wheel drive mode some of the time, I also drove it in rear-wheel drive most of the time to really do a comparison, and it was so much better, especially given that this should be an inferior model, given that it's performance oriented, yes, but not to what you'd expect of an SRT-10 level machine. The HEMI is more muscle, whereas the SRT is more like exotic truck territory. And it feels the total opposite. This holds the road better, it's more comfortable, the brakes felt better, it just was a more pleasant all-round experience, and it actually felt like it genuinely was as good as a European equivalent. With the European equivalent here being more so something like a Range Rover. In terms of engines, we touched on the fact, of course, that it ranges quite a bit from a 3.7 up to a 6.7. Even in terms of the gearboxes, they range quite a bit as well, all the way from a 4-speed auto up to an 8-speed auto. There is a 6-speed manual in there as well. And one of the things which I found quite novel on this one is I expected it to be a column shift, as they usually are, and occasionally you'll have, the center-mounted shifter. This one kind of had a bit of a hybrid, something which I'm sure it's featured on other vehicles, but I personally hadn't used it before. It has an almost Jag-style turn selector, like a twist knob like on a Jag XF, but it was mounted 90 degrees upward. So it was a vertical one instead of horizontal, as you can see in the video, which was interesting. It was quite fun to use that. In terms of driving it, well, I already touched on the fact that it felt way better than it has any right to, but I can't really stress that enough. I've driven Range Rovers as well, other large SUVs in the past, older and newer. Of course, my experience with owning those as well. I mean, I had a Touareg in the past. It's not the biggest of SUVs, but I'm used to, again, living with a larger SUV or 4x4. The Range Rover that I drove was the SVR, certainly quicker than these, but very, very big as well. And even compared to something like that, this can genuinely hold its own. Not in terms of performance, I'm talking about how it feels. The handling, the fact that it is a vehicle that's this big, this heavy, and potentially this cumbersome, to feel as good as it actually does is a testament to being better than you would ever expect it to be. I would say that despite the fact that Brits love to make so many jokes about American cars, both older and newer, and some are warranted, some really aren't, the majority of those jokes kind of fall flat when you actually get the chance to drive them. It's one of the many reasons why I actually love American cars. Mostly older ones, but some newer ones as well. And I would include this truck in there also. It's way better than you're thinking it could be, especially in terms of suspension, cornering, brakes. I mean, this thing can stop on a dime, and the brakes are seriously powerful. This particular one's selling for $25,000, so prices do vary, of course, depends on the year, depends on the spec, depends on the engine, and in the UK, you don't tend to have the greatest selection, maybe a couple of dozen for sale at any given time at best, with the majority of those being older ones. So, beggars can't be choosers. If you are looking for one, you kind of have to, go for whatever colour you can find or whatever spec you can find, or just wait, or I guess import one yourself. So the downside there is the lack of choice compared to the UK's Range Rovers, etc., where you can much more easily find what you're looking for. I would say, though, that for those who are considering something different, of course, something which still has the rough and ready four-wheel drive, the truck space, the interior space, of course, the off-road ability, the torquey, powerful engine, ticking all the boxes of a pickup truck in the general sense, even our smaller ones here, well, it does do all of that. And even though you're paying a bit more for it, what you're paying for isn't the fact that it's necessarily more powerful, you're not paying for it to be quicker, you're paying for the speciality of it. Most American cars over here have a markup on price. Just look at something like a C8 Corvette, look at the stupid prices that they are over here. It happens every time a newer vehicle like a Hellcat or a Corvette comes out. The markups are ridiculous in any foreign market. So in terms of living with one, like I said, I haven't lived with a truck, certainly not a Ram myself, but living with larger left-hand drive American vehicles, I can definitely say they're a lot easier to live with than you'd think. So if you are thinking about taking the plunge, at the very least, I would recommend giving it a test drive. The only thing that you need to remember when you're driving left-hand drive for the first time, especially a taller one like this, where you kind of feel disconnected a little bit because of how high up you are, is as long as you keep the left-hand curb or the left-hand white line roughly on the corner of the bonnet, you'll be okay. Because otherwise, especially the first time, your vision and your brain will want to return your line of sight to where it would usually be. And obviously in a left-hand drive truck, that means you're going to be driving in the middle of the road. So as long as you keep that in mind, you'll be fine. Once you get used to it, which really doesn't take long, I think you'll have a lot of fun. And jokes be damned. People in the UK love to make jokes about American cars, but I tell you what, every time I drive my Lincolns, people have nothing but smiles on their faces. For all of our jokes, Brits love American cars, and I would say that this is the experience that I wanted from the SRT-10. So my overall verdict, as you can tell, is a very positive one. I love this experience. I think this is a far better vehicle than the previous incarnation that I drove, and certainly a worthwhile truck to check out if you consider it. So of course, if you have owned one of these, either in the UK, but certainly in the States, I'd love to hear your thoughts, any potential issues that you think owners should look out for, or recommendations on transmissions and engines, which are the best versions. Then of course, drop all that down below, and check out the SRT-10 review as well if you are curious how that compares. But until next time, I'll see you then with more, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.